Hello, and welcome to another Enrichment with the Gifted Guy. The skill that we're going to be learning today is how to give a persuasive speech. So, what this is going to look like is I'm going to spend the first part of the video giving you tips on what to put into your persuasive speech or what your persuasive speech should look like. The second part is me going to be actually giving a persuasive speech. And the topic of that persuasive speech is why should you learn the skill? Why is it important? So I'm going to make a case for why learning how to speak persuasively can be a real benefit to you as a student and later on in life. So, what I'm going to start with are 12 tips that you should consider when you're going to give a persuasive speech. The first one is that structure matters. So what I mean by that is all stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And your speech should have a beginning, a middle, and an end as well. It should be a clear structure so people know when you're in your introduction phase, they know when you've gotten to the middle, they know when they've gotten to the ending or the conclusion. It's very clear, either through transitions or the way that what you're talking about, that needs to be clear. So for instance, the typical structure, if your beginning is that you're introducing your argument for what you're trying to persuade people of. So you need to make sure that's stated clearly. You might include a small example or an anecdote to illustrate your point, but you're simply stating what it is you're trying to persuade others of. The middle is when you are giving the evidence or the why of why someone should be persuaded. So this is what lawyers do when they present a case, that they have to present evidence to convince people one way or the other. And we'll get into what the evidence should look like in a little bit, but this evidence should definitely make a strong case for your point. Otherwise, you shouldn't use it. If the evidence is not going to make a strong point for your case, then you should not use that. And then the ending is kind of a restating of what it is you're trying to persuade them of and making a final point. You want to finish, I'll get to this later, but you do want to finish strong with a speech, especially a persuasive one. If you kind of peter out or give like a lousy ending to your speech, it's the last thing people will remember, and that's what they're going to remember about your speech. The second tip is that you should state your goal. So what I mean by that is don't be subtle about what it is you're trying to persuade people of. Don't try to kind of hide it between the lines, or just simply come out and state what it is you're trying to accomplish. What are you trying to persuade people of? And this should be stated more than once. So it should not just be in your introduction and in your conclusion. It should be, throughout the speech. You should be reminding people, this is what I'm trying to persuade you of. Keep that in mind as I keep speaking. So make sure that you are, consistent with that. You don't want to be overly repetitive to where they get sick of it, but you want to say it enough to where as they remember what you were saying and what you're trying to convince them of. The third tip is to use evidence. I kind of already touched on this, but the evidence that you use should be, evidence that people can believe in. So whether it be statistics, or whether it be research, or whether it be, quote from an individual, or whether it be, information you got from an interview, but it needs to be legitimate evidence. Because if you just say, I heard this guy on the street told me the other day, that's not very legitimate. And people are not going to believe that evidence as much as if it came from, say, a professor or some prestigious university or, something of that nature. So you want to make sure that you present evidence that it seems legitimate and strengthens your case. The fourth tip is to keep things short but sweet. What I mean by that is when you're speaking, you only have the attention of your audience for so long. Statistically, that shows that you pretty much can get 10 minutes of attention from someone, but not much more than that unless you change gears or make it so that they, you're kind of making them think about something else, then they're repaying attention. But you have a limited time. So you don't want to ramble on. You don't want to go off on tangents. You don't want to talk about things that have nothing to do or little to do with what it is you're talking about. You want to make sure that when you present your evidence, you present it succinctly, and it states what that is. And it also it is not rambling on. It just is giving the facts, and anything that you're given needs to be short but sweet. The fifth tip is to know your audience. So if I'm giving a speech to a group of young kids, That speech is going to look very different than if I'm giving a speech to adults who are professionals. Just like if I'm giving a speech to parents, that's going to look very different than if I'm giving a speech to fellow teachers or to students. So you have to know your audience. So in most cases, you'll be giving a professional persuasive speech. So you want to make your audience will be professional, and you want to make sure that you reflect that as well, and that you are professional. If you are, I'll give you an example. When I'm giving a persuasive speech to young kids, I may dress differently than I would, and my tone will be more casual and friendly and funny because I'm trying to set them at ease, and they don't care how I'm dressed more so, more than than a professional group that would maybe care the way that you dress. The sixth thing is posture matters. So what that means is when you're giving a speech, you should stand straight. You should not put your hands in your pockets or fold them in front of you, or lean to one side. You should make eye contact, and you can certainly speak with your hands. So you can be animated with your hands as you're speaking. You don't want to block your face though. But other than that, just keep your hands kind of to your side and make sure that you are making consistent eye contact with the audience. Not creepy staring eye contact, but the kind of eye contact where they know that they're being directly spoken to. And that's going to resonate much more with them. The seventh tip is to make sure you act like you care. When you give a speech, you should care about what it is you're trying to persuade others. Otherwise, why should they care about it? This doesn't mean that you necessarily believe in what it is you're trying to convince them of. Lawyers oftentimes have clients that they know are guilty, but they still have to try to get them off. And so they have to make a convincing argument, an authentic argument for their clients. Similarly, you may have to argue something that you don't necessarily personally agree with, but it needs to come across as though you do, as though you authentically believe in what it is that you are arguing for. And then that will go a long way with persuading people, because if you show passion for that or care for that, then they are going to return that in kind and also care about your topic. The eighth tip is to be confident. So what I mean by be confident is don't use a lot of ums and ahs when you pause. I have a habit of saying so a lot when I'm giving these tutorials, and I've become aware of that, and I try to do a better job of not using that word so much. But when you're confident, it means that you act like you know what you're talking about. So when you pronounce a word, I always tell students this: when you're pronouncing a word, pronounce it as though you know how it's pronounced. Whether you do or not, because if it's an uncommon word and you pronounce it confidently, people will just believe that that's the way it's pronounced. As a history teacher, I've had to pronounce all sorts of civilizations and people that I didn't know how to pronounce, but I just made sure that I was confident when I did that. That confidence will again be a persuasive tactic with the audience. So it's not just what you say; it's how you say it and the manner in which you say that can be persuasive as well. The ninth tip is to dress for success. So again, you need to know your audience and dress appropriately. So if I'm giving a speech to a bunch of teachers, I'm going to wear a collared shirt, or I'm going to wear a tie or something that looks professional. If I'm giving a speech to a bunch of kindergartners, I may wear a funny shirt. When I was teaching, I had funny ties because I taught elementary, middle, and junior high kids, and I wanted that to kind of set them at ease that I was serious, but not too serious. And so you do want to look professional, because you don't want people looking at your dress and wondering why you're dressed the way that you are. That would be distracting. You want them to give off the image that you are a professional and you are going to give a professional speech, because first impressions are really important. If you come in and you are not dressed professionally or appropriately, people are going to have difficulty believing you. So keep that in mind. The 10th tip I'm going to give you is to practice, practice, practice. You don't necessarily have to memorize your speech. But what you do have to do is practice it enough that you are familiar with it, that you can give it without having to read from a script. And so the more you practice, the more confident you'll get. You'll have a better understanding of where to place your hands and what your posture should look like. You'll get a sense of what is working in the argument, what is not, how things sound when they're said out loud. Because when you write things down, They may sound one way, but when you speak them out loud, they may sound another. And so you may have to change things or edit things in regard to that. But make sure you practice. That means practice in front of a mirror, practice to your stuffed animals or your dogs, practice to your parents and your brothers and sisters, and get feedback from people, not from the stuffed animals, of course, but from your parents and your siblings. The 11th tip is to, when you are presenting, present, don't read. I have been in presentations where people are reading off of a slide, a PowerPoint slide, what I can already read right there. And that's very painful to sit through those. Or they're reading from a speech, and because they're reading from a speech, they're looking down the entire time, and you're seeing the top of their head rather than looking at their eyes. So make sure that you are comfortable enough where you are presenting, that you're not reading your speech. Reading your speech, as persuasive as the content of that speech might be, if you read it to them, it is not going to be as persuasive than if you have a conversation with them, or you are making sure that you are presenting it in a conversational tone with them. The 12th and final tip I would like to give you is that you need to finish strong in your speech. This is really important because this is the last thing that people remember, is how you finished. So if you finish very weakly or very poorly, no matter what you said is kind of going to be wrecked or is going to lose legitimacy because of that weak finish. However, if you made some mistakes throughout your speech, but you finished strong, that may gloss over those mistakes or those oversights. And so finishing strong can be anything from finishing with a story that illustrates your point, to giving a quote, to giving a statement. Any of those would be good ways to finish a speech strongly. So the question I'm going to try to answer today is, why would it be important for people to learn to give persuasive speeches? What is the advantage to that? So imagine this. Imagine you have something that you feel very strongly about. You're very passionate about it. Within your inner core, you feel this more importantly than anything. And you feel like there's an injustice, not only to you, but to community, to the people around you, to the nation, to the world. And the only way for you to express this feeling is through speech, and to be able to tell others how you feel and to persuade them that the way that they think needs to change. This is exactly what Martin Luther King Jr. did when he gave his I Have a Dream speech in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. What he was doing was he was persuading people that blacks and whites could live together, that things could change, that it didn't have to be the way it was. And this was a big part of the civil rights movement. And it also changed the way that people thought about things, and it continues to be powerful to this very day. So his words and the way he was able to persuade people changed history. There are 5 reasons why it would be really important to learn how to give a persuasive speech. One of these is that's a skill not a lot of people have. When people are asked, would you like to give a speech or not, 90% of them would say no, which means that only 10% would be willing to do that. So if you're someone who's able to give a persuasive speech, if you are someone who has that skill, you're going to stand out from all the other people who aren't willing to do that. So that would be the first reason. The second reason is that you get your way a lot. You're persuasive. When they asked LinkedIn what are the top soft skills that a person could possess in the workforce, one of the top ones was the power of persuasion. So this is the power to persuade your employer, your fellow employees and peers, a client. So being able to persuade people is going to be a really valuable skill to have in the workplace, and it's going to get you far, that ability to do that. The third thing is it makes you a better communicator. When ZipRecruiter looked at 250,000 job listings, and they compared to what employees were looking for in these 250,000 listings, the number one thing that they were looking for was a good communicator. 51% of those listings were looking for a communicator. Only 21% were looking for college recruits. So in these listings, it was more important to be a good communicator than it was to get a college degree. Showing the importance of having this skill. The fourth reason why it would be important to be able to persuade others in a speech is that it develops other skills that are very valuable. So for instance, if you have to give a speech and you're trying to persuade someone to think differently than they normally would think, you're trying to get them to think like you would. That's using a lot of critical thinking. And that's a skill that's very valued. It's also using problem solving. So how do you solve this problem of them thinking a different way? How do you persuade them differently? That's problem solving. It also allows you to show leadership ability. And this is something that is coveted by a lot of employers and workplaces. They want people that show leadership skills, that are willing to stand up and be a leader. And being able to give up and give a persuasive public speech would be a really good way to show leadership. Our politicians do that to this very day. Our presidents, our leaders give impassioned and powerful speeches that make them stand out from everyone else and make people want to let them lead them. The fifth reason would be that kind of what I've laid out before is that it's going to lead to a job. So if you want to be a lawyer, you have to be a persuasive speaker. You're giving speeches all the time. If you want to be a politician, if you want to try to get clients, you have to persuade them to buy something. So it's going to lead to a really good job and the ability to move up in that job. Because if you have that ability, again, you're going to stand out from everyone else who is trying to do that job. So those are the reasons why it's really important to be able to give a good persuasive speech. And so hopefully you'll try that. And I'm going to leave you with the words of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said that speech is power. Speech is to persuade, to convert, to compel. Thank you. Now that I've given the speech, let's go back through and analyze it and see if I did all the tips that I suggested that you should do. So the first one is structure matters. So did I have a structure? I clearly did. I had an introduction that introduced what the actual topic was, which is writing or giving a persuasive speech. And I did a visual where I had them imagine if they were Martin Luther King Jr. and giving an important speech. And then I had my middle where I had my 5 reasons why. So the heart of my speech, which is the 5 reasons why one should learn how to do persuasive speech. And then I had conclusion, and I concluded with a quote. So a structure was there. State your goal. I stated it several times. I did in the introduction and the conclusion, nearly every time I introduced a new advantage during the middle part. So the goal was stated quite a bit. Using evidence. I used evidence from ZipRecruiter, from LinkedIn, and other job sites that I did research on as evidence, so that would back it up and make my statements legitimate. Keep it short but sweet. My speech was 5 minutes long, so I purposely tried to keep it under the 5-minute mark so that people would get the idea of what I wanted to do without me having to go on too much or where they eventually tune me out. So it was short but sweet. Knowing your audience. So my audience is you. And so having to give a speech on camera is a little more difficult than giving it to actual people. So I tried to make eye contact with the camera as much as possible so that I was addressing you as the audience, so you could see that I was speaking to you. Posture matters. I didn't cross my arms. I didn't stick my hands in my pocket. I stood straight, and I made sure that I was, when I was giving my speech, that I was giving it in a professional manner. Act like you care. Be authentic. So I feel like I feel very strongly about this topic. And so it's not just doing it for the sake of the speech. So it was easy to be authentic and to express how important a skill this is. I would say as a teacher that this is one of the most important skills that I can give a student, is them learning how to publicly speak or give a persuasive speech. Be confident. Don't and ah. In my 5-minute speech, I think there was a couple times where I hesitated, or I didn't or ah, but I had other things in there. And so it wasn't perfect, but it shouldn't have to be perfect. And it wasn't so much that it really stood out. Dress for success. So I put on a collared shirt just for this speech so that I would be dressed professionally and so that I looked nice. Practice, practice, practice. The version that you saw was probably about the 10th version that I did. So I started out, I gave my speech, I messed up a bunch of times. So I was doing practice, 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 practice. And even when I went to film, it took me 3 or 4 times of filming it to land on the one that you see here. So there was quite a bit of practice put into it. And the advantage is that each time I practiced, the more confident I got, the more and more I remembered certain parts. So I try not to look down at my notepad too much where I had some notes jotted down. And the more I practiced, the less I had to do that. So present, don't read. You can see I didn't have anything in front of me. I did have a notepad to the side that had some notes jotted on it, so to remind me of things. And I glanced down at that occasionally, but I wasn't staring at it, and it wasn't in front of me to be a distraction. So I feel like I did a pretty good job of presenting and not reading it. And lastly, was finishing strong. I chose to use a quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson, which I felt was a pretty appropriate quote, and that's how I finished. And hopefully, that was a strong finish. So you can see I followed all my tips, and hopefully that you think that that was a persuasive speech on giving persuasive speeches.